Is France or NATO really considering sending ground troops into Ukraine? Let's take a look at this news article and find out if we can. This is written by The Guardian, and it says that French President Emmanuel Macron refused to rule out sending ground troops to Ukraine, but said no consensus existed on that step. It was at a meeting of 20 mainly European leaders inside Paris that was convened by Macron to ramp up the European response to the Russian military advances that are happening inside Ukraine right now as we speak. So what happened was a reporter asked Macron, have you guys been discussing the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine? And this was an off-the-cuff question as far as I know, and his response was word for word. He said, there's no consensus to officially back any ground troops. That said, nothing should be excluded. We will do everything that we can to make sure that Russia does not prevail. Everyone's wondering, did Macron intend to say this? Was he always planning, nefariously thinking, I'm going to say this at this conference and I'm going to float this idea of ground troops inside Ukraine to test the waters, to see what Russia's response will be? And we'll get to that in a second. For that to be true, that means that this question would have to have been planted ahead of time. Someone would have had to have said, hey, make sure you ask Macron if they've been talking about this contingency, this idea that we might send troops into Ukraine. So that would require a fair bit of thinking, some forethought, really, some premeditation there. And that's what people are discussing online. They're asking, was this a purpose intent? Did Macron want to float that idea? So this is from the Associated Press. Lorraine Cook and Karol Jekinek, they said European military heavyweights Germany and Poland affirmed Tuesday they would not be sending troops to Ukraine after reports that some Western countries may be considering doing so as the war with Russia enters its third year. The head of NATO also said that the US-led military alliance has no plans to send troops to Ukraine. So the article tries to figure out why this is happening, and French officials apparently have become worried that there's no single galvanizing Western force responding to Putin, putting his economy on such an effective war footing, and insufficiently clear practical responses that had emerged from the West. He said the meeting, called in haste by Macron in the wake of the Ukrainian front line starting to crumble, had agreed to focus on 5 key action areas. So at this meeting with these 20 different European countries, they're talking about cyber defense, joint production of military weapons and ammunition in Ukraine, defense of countries directly threatened by Russia's offensive, such as Moldova, greater military protection for Ukraine on its border with Russian-backed Belarus. They're also talking about demining of Ukraine. He also announced a new coalition to provide a long and medium-range strike missile capability. So they're here, they're spitballing all these different ideas. They're talking about different contingency plans at this meeting. They're probably having a couple of drinks, maybe sharing some cuisine from their different European countries. And the reason this whole meeting was called in the first place is because we're starting to see the front line in Ukraine. People are saying that it's starting to crumble. And so these world leaders that live in this region are getting together and they're trying to think ahead. They're trying to plan ahead and figure out, what do we do if this happens or if this happens? Because right now, nobody knows what's going to happen. Is Ukraine going to fall back 10, 20 kilometers and then they're going to have fixed lines there? Or are they going to continue to fall back? Nobody knows. The stakeholders in the region, the people that have the most on the line, are getting together and they're talking about different ideas. So one of the ideas that apparently they've been talking about is, what if we sent non-combat troops into Ukraine? So if we sent boots on the ground without having the boots on the ground? What if there were just troops that were helping out with logistics, who were helping to train Ukrainian soldiers inside Ukraine so that they don't have to fly or bus them all the way to Germany and then all the way back, which costs a lot of money and also costs a lot of time. So they're trying to think of different solutions. They're trying to figure out how they can better, basically, they need to increase what they're doing, because it appears like it's not, everything that they've been doing is not having the intended effects. They want to freeze the front lines at the least, or stop Russia from getting any closer to them. So they're insisting Russia's defeat is absolutely essential for peace and security in Europe. He said it was necessary for Europe to move from words into action, so clear decisions are made to build a European defense pillar independent of America. So you might be familiar with the fact that right now the United States is withholding aid. They're not sending more aid at this point. There's a border crisis in the United States that the Republicans are tying Ukrainian aid to. They don't want that border crisis to go unaddressed before addressing what's happening in Ukraine. At least that's one way of looking at it. So the European powers and the powers that are near Ukraine are getting together and saying, okay, we might have to rethink about how we've been approaching this situation. Because for the past 2 years, they've been doing it one way, and that's been the U.S. has led this effort, and French President Macron is thinking maybe that's no longer the right way for them to go forward. Maybe they need to come up with new solutions. At least that's just how I'm reading the situation. At present, 30% of all funding from Ukraine came from Europe, Macron said, but added that it was possible to increase this through further bilateral and EU-level agreements, so that ammunition supplies could be increased threefold overall. We know right now that I believe Russia got 3 million artillery shells from North Korea. It sounds like maybe half of that artillery shells actually work and fire, but that's still over 1 million artillery shells. And on the other side of the fence, you got other countries that are trying to free up their ammunition supplies to send to Ukraine right now, especially artillery, because it sounds like that's what they really need the most and they're the most short on. He admitted Europe had failed to meet its over-optimistic promise to provide Ukraine with 1 million rounds of ammo. He said the provisions of ammunition was now the top priority, pointing to gunpowder shortages creating bottlenecks. So the Guardian's article goes on, but he asserts European countries had room for maneuver both to increase production in Europe and also to purchase surplus ammo stockpiles outside Europe to hand to Ukraine, a proposal advanced by the Czech Republic. So that's the Czech Republic are the ones that say, hey, we found something like 1 million artillery shells, and if we get the right funding, we'd be able to sell it to Ukraine. He again supported the Estonian plan for the EU to issue defense bonds to guarantee long-term defense markets for industry, a proposal that has not yet found favor in Germany or the Netherlands, two countries traditionally opposed to the issuance of EU debt. This is a geopolitical shock coming from one side that justifies what the Estonians have proposed. The objective, he said, was to ensure Ukraine can negotiate peace and return to full territorial sovereignty. So I was just reading something by the Institute for the Study of War, and they were saying that because Russia appears more confident in themselves and they believe that they can continue to take more land, and they've kind of run the numbers, so to speak. They've done their calculations. They've looked at the rate of losses that they have, and they believe that they can sustain those losses for the next 2-3 years. And if they do that, they'll continue gaining ground. So when it comes to the peace negotiations, that makes them take a more harsh stance than they might have a year ago. So let's talk for a minute about what Putin's response was. And it appears like Putin threatens nuclear war to NATO troops if they go to Ukraine. And this is a little bit ambiguous. Does it mean that he will fire off nukes if there's just training and advisory soldiers that are sent to Ukraine in a non-combat role? Or does it mean that Putin will only fire off nukes if they're sent as a frontline combat option sent from NATO to Ukraine? So let's read a little bit of this Washington Post article by Francesca Ebel and Robin Dixon. They say that Russian President Vladimir Putin used his annual State of the Nation address on Thursday, I think it was about 2 hours long that he talked for, to take an aim at the West, threatening to use nuclear weapons against NATO countries if they send forces to help defend Ukraine from a Russian victory. In a speech to Russian Federal Assembly that was predominantly dedicated to Russia's domestic affairs, Putin delivered a tough warning, threatening retaliatory strikes against the West in the event of attacks on Russian territory. So here's what he said word for word. Quote, "They must understand that we also have weapons that can hit targets on their territory." He warned of tragic consequences if NATO forces were ever deployed to Ukraine. All this really threatens a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons and the destruction of civilization. Don't they get that? Western leaders, he continued, thought that the war is a cartoon, adding that Russia's strategic nuclear forces are in a state of full readiness. Thursday's warning was unusually sharp, according to the Washington Post article. They're talking about the possible deployment of NATO military contingents to Ukraine, said Putin, referring to this week's comments by President Emmanuel Macron. So Russia appears to be relishing the gaffe that French President Emmanuel Macron made this week in suggesting that NATO countries discuss the possibility of Western ground troops being deployed to Ukraine, saying such an eventuality can't be ruled out. So in this take, the French president didn't mean to float the idea of sending Ukraine troops so that they could test the waters with that idea. It was just a mistake. He just misspoke. And now this is causing different leaders in NATO to have different opinions and say, no, we don't feel that way. We weren't discussing that. And now Russia is taking advantage of this disarray, according to this take. It's interesting to see this disarray story because I've been noticing this in other media reports. So there's this other story that came out that I think is related, where the German chancellor was slammed for revealing British military role inside of Ukraine. Sending long-range German missiles to Ukraine would require deployment of German troops in the war zone, said Germany's chancellor, Scholz. So why is that the case? Because I think the German chancellor was asked, why haven't you sent more long-range missiles to Ukraine? And his answer was, well, we haven't done that because then it would require us to send ground troops on the ground to be there to make sure that those missile GPS coordinates are only fired inside targets that are not inside deep in Russia. That's my understanding, is that. So by saying that, people are saying that he revealed that since Storm Shadow missiles are being fired by Ukraine already, that must mean that there's British special forces or British troops on the ground in Ukraine helping with that targeting of Russian troops, which is kind of a red line that they agreed that NATO troops would not help with the direct targeting of Russian troops. That's my understanding. I could be wrong. Scholz asserted that delivering the missiles to Ukraine would require sending German soldiers to Ukraine for their use or deployment. But we don't know for a fact that that's the case for how the UK missiles work. Maybe it is. The German chancellor has also taken flack from opposition parties in the country's parliament. So this could be an internal political dispute that they're taking advantage of. Maybe he misspoke or appeared to have said something that could be misinterpreted. But when we put this together with another really important story that just broke, all these stories are happening around the same time. Earlier last month in February, Germany's Chancellor Scholz vows serious probe for leaks of the army about talks in Ukraine. So the Russian FSB started circulating these videos online. I think I could pull it up right now. So OSINT Defender wrote that the German Ministry of Defense and Chancellor of Olaf Scholz have confirmed the authenticity of a recent phone conversation between high-ranking members of the German military, which was intercepted and leaked by the Russian intelligence, talking about the possible transfer of long-range cruise missiles to Ukraine and their use in targeting the Kerch Strait Bridge between mainland Russia and Crimea. At the same time, the New York Times just dropped a giant story about how the CIA has been working with Ukraine, how they set up 12 listening posts on the border with Russia, and how they helped train the Ukrainian intelligence operatives. The ground branch special activities of CIA have been working with Ukrainian intelligence for the past over 10 years now, since 2014. This has all just recently been revealed. It appears like this article was written in collaboration with the CIA. They kind of gave it their stamp of approval. And what's been happening for the past 10 years is there's been this kind of shadow war between Russia and the United States over influence inside of Ukraine. So I think that's why there's this theory out there right now that all of these different stories in the past month about kind of pushing the envelope on different operations that are happening inside NATO right now, what the different European countries are doing and the United States are doing in Ukraine. And the theory is that people are being made more comfortable with the idea of really ground troops going to Ukraine. So why is this all happening around right now? The theory is that it's because Russia has started to show signs of localized air superiority in Ukraine for the first time. What this means is that for the first time since the beginning of the war, Russia has finally, for the first time, been able to start operating with their jets, getting close air support for their troops. This is what's allowed them to move forward, take Avdiivka, is this new advantage for them. And if it's true, if they're able to maintain that, then what people are looking at is, what do we do if Russia continues to advance, keeps pushing? The leaders have to think about eventualities of, let's say, hypothetically, Russia were to collapse the front line of Ukraine and capture the entire country and be all the way up to the border with Poland. Do we let that happen? How do we stop that from happening? These are discussions that I imagine they would be having right now. What are the different options? And let's say one of the options were to send non-combat troops to Western Ukraine, just to kind of cement the idea that you can't go past the Dnipro River. Then one way to do that would be to float it at a meeting like that. So that's the theory. But I'm very interested to hear what you guys think. I want to know what your thoughts are. I'm obviously not an expert on international affairs. I just find this stuff fascinating, and I hope I brought the key points and the key information to your attention here. That's what I want to do with this, is to just kind of hit the highlights, tell you the main points, and get your reaction, because I really want to know what other people's reaction is to this. So thank you for stopping by and watching this, and I look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts in the comment section.